But I do wonder if Sunak made a mistake today. There was a lot of back and forth as to whether Lee Anderson and Brendan Clark-Smith as deputy party chairs could back the amendments without losing their jobs. There was a lot of, well, they're party jobs rather than government jobs. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. It was very last minute. It was minutes before the vote when they were told, no, they can't. And I think that shows a sort of weakness in Sunak's position, that at the last minute he suddenly went, no, actually it will look too bad if they back the amendment, so I'm going to say they're going to lose their jobs in the hope that they won't. Well, they went on and did. They resigned, and now the right of the party is very, very upset.
A bit of news coming in, 2 bits of news coming in. Let me share that with you. There's been another resignation over the asylum legislation. Jane Stevenson, who is the parliamentary private secretary to a cabinet minister, has resigned, unhappy with the legislation. And not just any cabinet minister, it is you on there, Rachel, because we were just talking about it. It is
Kemi Badenoch.
Did you read anything into that?
Well, she spoke. Jane Stevenson spoke in the debate. I sat there for all 3 hours in the Commons. You're very welcome. And what was really noticeable was Labour and the SNP didn't really get involved at all. It was very much Tory on Tory in the debate, and Jane Stevenson spoke very passionately in favour of the amendments. And even at the time I was looking at it and going, oh, I'm not sure how you can stay on the government payroll having just made that speech, and now we learn that she is gone.
Yeah, PPSs aren't on the payroll. They don't get any money for their enormous efforts, but they are part of the government
metaphorical
family.
Payroll, yes.
Indeed. And
the bag carriers, as that often known in Parliament.
Carrying the bag no longer. She has walked. Another bit of news just breaking. Seb, you were talking about the Reform Party hovering, looking no doubt to capitalise on the government's problems over the asylum to Rwanda policy. Well, they've announced, the Reform Party, that they're going to put up a candidate in the by-election coming up in Kingswood. Now, that has been obviously opened up by the resignation of Chris Skidmore. He's got his differences with the government over environment, net zero policy, but there will be a by-election in Kingswood in Gloucestershire, and it's going to be a tough one for the Tory party to hold.
It's interesting they've changed their mind on that, because the Reform Party had come out to say that Chris Skidmore had stood down over his pretty, ardent net zero position, that he very much believes in pushing as hard and fast as possible to decarbonise the UK economy. And he felt that, he was in disagreement with the government on this and decided to leave, even though he was going to resign come the general election. And the Reform Party have something of a different approach on net zero, and they said they weren't going to stand a candidate because this by-election will cost in the region of £250,000. So it'll be interesting to see why they're doing that now. I assume just to try and make trouble for the Conservative Party, since that's what Reform exists to do for most of their situation. But, that seat has been a classic marginal.
Yes.
It went Labour in 1992. Chris Skidmore won it back in 2010 for the Conservatives. And I think even in that election, it wasn't really on the Conservative target seat. It was sort of a surprise they won it. So I think that's going to be a tough battle for the Conservatives to hold on to that one. Reform probably doesn't help either.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a fascinating test of Reform, isn't it? Because after the poll earlier in the week, it was suggested by some who want to push the Conservative Party, the Conservative government, further to the right in their approach to issues, including asylum. They were saying Reform is waiting, and if Reform were off the stage, then that we'd be looking at a hung parliament, not a massive hammering. Now, that analysis has been very heavily questioned by YouGov and others, because it was based on the idea that the Conservative support would just flood back in if Reform were off the stage. And that can't be said, I don't think, with any reliability at all. But this Kingswood by-election is going to be an interesting test.
It is. And John and you and I did maths at school, and we know about how you do statistics and how you add numbers together.
Yeah.
And what happened with that poll was the fact they'd taken the Reform vote, added to the Conservative Party vote, and say, QED, you're going to get a Conservative victory. That's not how it works. Reform voters split many different ways, because they are the successor to the Brexit Party and UKIP. And back in, I think, 2015 or so, UKIP took 2/3 of its votes from the Labour Party.
Yes.
But I think in that Kingswood by-election for Reform, it will be interesting to see how well they do outside of their natural territory, because in the other by-election that we've got coming up in Wellingborough, which is Peter Bone, who stood down, and that by-election is also happening on the same date. That is one where there's always been quite a strong UKIP Brexit Party vote, and they would do well there, and I think that's the feeling there. But Kingswood in Gloucestershire, the outskirts of Bristol, doesn't really feel like somewhere it's their natural territory, it'll be a fascinating one to watch.
And listen, talking to Luke Trill from More in Common, the Post, earlier this week, he was saying that the proportion of the vote that could go to the Conservatives if Reform were to magically evaporate maybe about a quarter. So that is not the game changer that obviously the right-wingers who are pushing for change would like to see. But the by-elections are going to be very, very interesting. So the asylum bill, the bill to deport, or seeks to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda, it's a bit of a tangle. That's an understatement. The Conservative Party split. There's a fight in the Commons, one in the Lords coming. There are more fights in the courts ahead. Now, the public, we know in the polls, they don't really believe the Rwanda plan can work. Not that they have a great deal more faith in Labour making the whole thing work. But as it stands, Sebastian, is there any way Rishi Sunak can come through this on top?
Well, we were just talking about the numbers in the break there on this, and don't forget, in the last time when this bill came forward, there was a significant number on the right who abstained but didn't vote against the bill, and that's really the conversation for the next 24 hours. Does that pool of people who voted for the amendments, do they translate into voting against the bill? And the whips will be doing all their work so over the next 24 hours to try and ensure they abstain, because obviously this is a major piece of legislation. It's a huge moment for Rishi Sunak, and for Conservative MPs, they were told just yesterday by Isaac Levido, who is the campaign chief for the Tories' upcoming election campaign, that united parties don't win elections, and now is the moment to get behind the Prime Minister. And this is the test of it. Do they do that, or do they decide to vote against it? And I tend to think when it comes to it, they will rally behind it. And even if they're not happy, they're more likely to abstain than vote against it and bring it down.
Yeah, I mean, I put it, Rachel, to Tom Hunt, one of the right-wingers in the Common Sense group earlier on, that, you know, from their colleagues in the party on the centre-left of the Tory party, from commentators, from almost anyone you ask, the suggestion is that a lot of these rebels, their bark is so much worse than their bite. They build up to big confrontations, and when the time comes, they kind of find ways not to follow through. And that's going to be a pretty widespread expectation.
Well, the interesting thing with the rebellions on this side of the party, the right of the party, the more Brexity wing of the party, is that they have proved very successful in the past at shouting a lot, being very vocal, tabling all these amendments, and then getting the government to cave and compromise and back them. And you really get the very strong impression that that's what they were expecting to happen here. They abstained, 28 of them abstained on second reading, and what they were saying was, we have time now between December, when it comes back in January, to toughen it up, and we really believe that the Prime Minister will listen to our concerns and make those amendments. And that didn't happen. Downing Street called their bluff, essentially, or if you want to look at it another way, was torn between amendments on both sides as well, and so didn't take those amendments. And now they're kind of stuck. They voted for these amendments. The amendments haven't passed. Okay, tomorrow we're going to get the third reading. All of them, if you ask them, is the current bill an improvement on the present situation, will say yes. They'll all say we support the principle of the bill. They'll all say we support the government, what the government's trying to do. We just want to make it a little bit better. So are they really going to vote something down that they have all said is an improvement on the current situation? Some of them will, I think. You'll get a handful. Will you get 60? I think highly unlikely. Will you get 28, 29, which is what's needed to defeat the government if they join Labour? It's a tough one. I would say probably not quite.
The question on this, you've hit exactly, Rachel, is the perfect enemy of the good in this situation. That this bill is one of the toughest, probably the toughest migration bill that's gone before Parliament over the last 14 years since the Conservatives returned to power, that has some, pretty draconian measures in it to try and deal with the small boats issue here. And the question for those Conservative MPs who want it toughened up is there any compromise space? They've shown their hand with the vote tonight. Then we've got this ultimate vote tomorrow, and it could well be the government tries to table, amend, tweak, toughen the language. And the right bloc is not united. That, for example, Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, came out today and said she backs the bill for those reasons, that it is tough and it does do a lot of things that she would like to have done when she was Home Secretary. And I think for those people, we've got to ask the question, do you want to pull the whole edifice down to try and get something even tougher when it's already at the kind of limit of what it feels like the Prime Minister can do? Because we talk a lot about the right flank on this. The flip side, of course, is the left flank of the Conservative Party. And the One Nation group, which is headed by Damien Green, the former Deputy Prime Minister, and Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary, they've said they're not going to move one iota either. So if he was to move, you'll then start losing MPs from the other side. So I think between now and tomorrow night, we could see some movement, some commitments, some tweaks from the government.
But cosmetic. cosmetic changes.
Quite, because I think going beyond that is going to create more problems for the other side.
Yeah, I wonder about Rwanda, the Rwandan government in all of this. At a pretty early stage, the Rwandan government was saying, look, whatever anyone else says, we do not be seen to be falling foul of international human rights law. And in one way, that rather suited Rishi Sunak, because they said, look, they've tied our hands. We can only go so far, or the whole thing is pulled off the table by Rwanda. But now Rishi Sunak is saying, look, leave the bill as it is, but if the European Court of Human Rights comes forward with an order saying that flight full of deportees can't take off, we'll ignore it. Now, saying that, what does Rwanda make of that? That's a very clear public pre-defiance of international law.
I mean, my prediction is that Rwanda will go along as long as the government keeps paying them huge sums of money, which at the moment they don't really have to do anything in return for other than go on a couple of press trips with whoever happens to be Home Secretary at the time. It is true that the government's in a very narrow space between what the right will accept, what the One Nation group will accept, what Rwanda will accept. I mean, this moved far beyond actually solving the issue of illegal channel crossings a very long time ago. This is about Rishi Sunak and his leadership, and about the fractures in the Conservative Party. It's not really about whether the bill will work in practice. It has to get through the Lords, it has to get through the courts. You know, the practicality of it isn't the issue. But I do wonder if Sunak made a mistake today. There was a lot of back and forth as to whether Lee Anderson and Brendan Clark-Smith as deputy party chairs could back the amendments without losing their jobs. There was a lot of, well, they're party jobs rather than government jobs. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. It was very last minute. It was minutes before the vote when they were told, no, they can't. And I think that shows a sort of weakness in Sunak's position, that at the last minute he suddenly went, no, actually it will look too bad if they back the amendment, so I'm going to say they're going to lose their jobs in the hope that they won't. Well, they went on and did. They resigned, and now the right of the party is very, very upset.
But just on that, I mean, obviously the Prime Minister is trying to get this through without trying to lose people from his payroll voters' court. And as you said, there's the parliamentary bag carriers, the people who are party figures who are not ministers in this situation. And I think there's been a lot of genuine debate on this, because the three people who have resigned, Lee Anderson, Brendan Clark-Smith and Jane Stevenson, they all represent seats that what you might classify as red wall seats. They're traditionally Labour seats that voted Conservative, some for the first time ever at the last election, and they really care about immigration. And that, you know, if you talk about the issues of ranked to the public, that would be pretty high up in those seats there. So I think both for who they represent and who they are as MPs, that's why they've taken this tough position on this.
Which only underlines the fact that it's a significant vote of no confidence on the part of very prominent members of the party machine. Lee Anderson was brought in to buy credibility, demonstrate credibility with the old red wallers, the defectors from Labour, to appeal and boost and bolster that sort of, broadly speaking, right-wing credibility. To walk away like this is a blow to all of that. And he might as well be on the payroll. It doesn't matter that he's not paid and he's paid by the party. This is going to get headlines. Of course it is, and they're not helpful.
But the flip side is, if they had been allowed to stay in position, then you would have had a party discipline issue.
It would have looked appalling.
So, and the fact is that for those three MPs, to go back to the point we were talking about earlier, do they want no Rwanda bill? Because if they vote this down, the bill doesn't get through, then what? You know, the government's not going to bring it back. There's not an alternative strategy on the table here. And I don't really know what the game plan is, because this is the question for those people who voted for the amendments today is, do they want to hold out for something else in the future? I don't know what that is. Or do they want to say, actually, this is the best we're going to get? And for those people, they clearly felt differently about where, I don't know what their longer term plan is for this, but ultimately I still think the majority of Conservative MPs will vote for this through. But obviously it's been a bruising period.
There seems to be a bit of a consensus. Yes, Rachel.
I don't think there is a game plan for some of them. I think for some of them it was about pressure and leverage and trying to get the government to back their amendments, which hasn't happened. For some of them it's about sending a message to their constituents that they are very tough on immigration. It's signalling. But I think for some of them it's pure rage, really, at the way the government is behaving, the chaos of the last, 12, 18 months, and the fact that Sunak wasn't elected by a normal leadership race.
And a bit of every man and woman for himself at this stage. I mean, the ship being perceived to be going down look, go for the lifeboats. And if you're not on a lifeboat, just jump over the side anyway. Look, I mean, we're going to be seeing, there seems to be a bit of a consensus in the room at the moment here in the studio that the government's going to get through this thing in one piece tomorrow night. If that turns out not to be the case, it's going to be a lively programme tomorrow evening. So
You're
here
going to have
on
us back.
Come back and join in. Everyone welcome.